If I was to ask you to think of a serial killer from the Victorian era, chances are Jack the Ripper would be the name that springs to mind. But what if I was to tell you there was a serial killer operating around the same time whose crimes were arguably much worse, on a scale much grander, with means much more insidious and victims much more innocent? Today, we're taking a look back at the crimes of Old Mother Dyer. Amelia Elizabeth Dyer, née Hobley, was the youngest of 5 siblings born in the small village of Pile Marsh near Bristol. For most part, her young life was bright. She was the daughter of a master shoemaker and was lucky enough to learn to read and write, developing a love of poetry and literature. The brightness didn't last long. Her mother suffered from severe mental illness brought on by typhus, and being the youngest sibling, Dyer was obliged to care for her ailing mother, and she descended into madness. During this period, her older sister Sarah Ann died, and her mother went on to have another daughter a few years later, who they also named Sarah Ann, sadly also passing away a few months after birth. Her mother eventually succumbed to her illness, and Dyer left the family home and moved to Bristol, where she eventually met and married George Thomas. He was 59 years old, Amelia 24. On their marriage certificate, they both lied about their ages to lessen the gap, her adding 6 years, he, surprisingly, subtracting 11. After the marriage, Dyer began training to become a nurse, and during this time, she met midwife Ellen Dane, who herself was a very sinister figure. She informed Dyer of an easier way to make money by using her home as lodgings for young women who had conceived illegitimately. Life in Victorian Britain was hard for single mothers who had children out of wedlock. In 1834, the Poor Law Amendment Act removed any obligation for the fathers to pay for their unplanned offspring, leaving mothers in a difficult financial bind. This, along with the general stigmatizing of single parenthood and illegitimacy, gave rise to the practice of baby farming, wherein individuals, nefarious or otherwise, would act as adoption or fostering agents in return for regular payments or an upfront fee from the mothers. Many businesses were set up to look after the pregnant women, and upon birth, the baby would be left behind to be cared for as a nursed child. The whole situation was ripe for financial exploitation, and that is exactly what happened. If the child came from well-off parents who simply wanted to keep the birth secret, then agents would charge a one-off fee of up to £80. The vast majority of those seeking their services were impoverished, however, and they would command a fee of £5. A good yearly wage would have been around the £20 to £30 mark, so that seemingly meagre amount accounted for a large chunk of someone's yearly income. If the child managed to be fostered or find a permanent home, then everyone would be happy. But these were dark times, and it wasn't unheard of for some agents to starve or in some other way hasten the death of the infants in their care. This was Victorian Britain, and getting your hands on hard drugs was as easy as taking a trip to your local chemist. A syrup known colloquially as mother's friend was a favourite at the time. This opium-based medicine was used to calm screaming babies. A lot of the times these screams were for food, and so this was used to ease them into starving to death. For those that couldn't get their hands on that, alcohol was a widely used alternative. Coroners at the time would often record the deaths as debility from birth or lack of mother's milk. Others would simply put starvation, as this wasn't an uncommon occurrence, even in a caring Victorian home. Parents who wanted to check up on the children they left behind would often come up against a brick wall. Most, however, were too ashamed to pursue any thoughts of wrongdoing they may have had. This is the world that had been revealed to Amelia Dyer, and with the birth of her own daughter and the passing of her elderly husband, she found herself in need of an income. Despite all the years caring for her mother and those spent nursing the ill, Dyer turned her hand to baby farming with sickening ease. She advertised to nurse and adopt babies in return for a substantial one-off payment along with adequate clothing for the child. She assured her clients that she offered a warm and loving home. In 1872, Amelia married William Dyer and they had 2 children of their own. This didn't soften Amelia's dark heart. In fact, she grew tired of waiting for the poor children left in her care to starve, instead moving to kill them outright through strangulation and other means. This was long before forensic tools were available to the police, and so Dyer had little trouble avoiding their attention. That was until one doctor grew suspicious of the amount of child deaths he had been called to certify at her home. She soon found herself in front of a judge, not charged with murder or manslaughter, however, but the lesser charge of neglect. She was found guilty and sentenced to a mere 6 months hard labour. Despite the leniency of the sentence, Dyer found it difficult going. Upon release, she tried to resume a nursing career, this being interspersed with periods inside mental hospitals for alleged mental instability and suicidal thoughts. It must be noted that these times inside coincided quite well with times that she needed to disappear from the prying eyes of the authorities. Dyer had spent time as an asylum nurse and knew how to act to ensure a speedy trip inside and a comfortable existence therein. The baby farming had started again, but instead of learning her lessons, she simply grew more deceptive. She no longer called upon doctors to issue death certificates and instead began to dispose of the bodies. Once more, the authorities tried to pursue her, not least after one woman returned to check upon her child and, sensing Dyer's suspicious ways, asked to see a birthmark on the child's hip. It wasn't there, and Dyer soon moved town. This was another tactic she would employ. Once the heat got too much in one town, she fled to another, using a multitude of aliases. She would eventually end up here in Caversham in Reading. And already separated from her husband, she would find herself a new, unsuspecting associate, one Jane Granny Smith. Now, Jane would always be referred to as mother, especially in front of new and unsuspecting parents. This, of course, was to engender a feeling of mother-daughter loving relationship, especially when they were about to hand over their child and indeed money. By now, lying and murder were second nature for Dyer. Advertising her services in Bristol newspapers under the name of Mrs. Harding, she would travel to collect her latest victim. Feigning the image of a caring would-be adopter, then instead of making her way back to Reading, she would travel to her daughter's house in Willesden, London. Once there, she would use edging tape used in dressmaking, wind it around her victim's neck, pulling tightly until they were no more. She later said that she used to enjoy watching them with the tape around their necks. She would then place the bodies in bags and/or suitcases and, weighed down with bricks, come to a secluded spot here by the river in Caversham and place them in the water. On March the 30th, 1896, one of those packages was found by a bargeman. It contained the body of Helena Fry, one of Dyer's most recent victims. The police were alerted to the find and, with the help of some microscopic investigation, were able to find, along with a train ticket to Bristol Templemeads train station, an address and the name Mrs. Thomas, another of Dyer's aliases. Using these details along with the subsequent investigation, they were able to track down Dyer, raiding her home on April the 3rd. Officers say they were struck by the stench of decomposition in the home, though no bodies were found. They did, however, find telegrams and letters from mothers who had left their children with Dyer, along with receipts for adverts placed and reels of edging tape. The police found that in the past few months alone, 20 children had been put in the care of Amelia Dyer. After her arrest on the 4th of April, they dredged the Thames and a further 6 victims were discovered. Dyer only admitted to one of the murders, and in a letter written from her cell at Reading Jail, she says that she acted alone, absolving her daughter and son-in-law who had been arrested along with her. They were later released without charge. Also in the letter, Dyer says that she hoped to be forgiven for her acts in heaven. At her trial, the only defense she offered was insanity. The prosecution argued successfully that her exhibitions of mental instability had been ploys designed to throw off suspicions. It took the jury just over 4 minutes to find her guilty, sentencing her to death, and on June the 10th, 1896, she perhaps felt a little of what she had inflicted on others as a noose was placed around her neck and tightened before the trapdoor was released and she was hanged. Despite being charged for 6 murders, it's thought that her victims numbered many more. Some say as many as 300 or more. The Dyer case caused a national outcry which saw changes to adoption laws and helped to establish the fledgling NSPCC charity. It would take time for the practice of baby farming to be fully stamped out, however, and 2 years after the death of Amelia Dyer at a train station in Plymouth, a sum of money and a young life were handed over to a woman who used a false name and made promises she didn't intend to keep. Upon leaving the mother and boarding a train, the woman pocketed the money and placed the child in a box and left it on an empty train line, alone to die. Rail workers found the parcel. Inside, a 3-week-old, cold, wet, but alive. The mysterious woman that had left her to die was thought to be none other than Polly Dyer, the daughter of Amelia. Well, that concludes a pretty dark and heavy episode. Thank you for watching, and if you made it this far, why not consider subscribing? This is a pretty new channel for us, and we're still deciding what content to bring you guys. So let us know in the comments box below what you'd like to see more of. With that said, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.